Spaghetti in the Oodle Noodle fantasy.
Young Edward slouched back in his chair. He knew he had reached the end of a long day's work and rewarded himself with a nice bowl of spaghetti. So he stretched his limbs and reclined his legs. He could feel the warmth of the fresh bowl of spaghetti placed in his now crossed legs. The feeling sweltered from his thighs up to his spine. Edward dipped his face toward the ever-growing steam that enveloped his face. The smell traveled through his nostrils and danced beneath his lungs. He let the steam fall gently from his nose. That sweltering feeling became the utmost pleasure. Eddie couldn't resist. He gripped his instrument and dug right in the bowl. Rolled a nice thick lock, and raised it into his mouth. He slid his tongue along the smooth bumps and unloaded the sauce into his mouth. Pressing his lips against the cold metal only enhanced the sensation going on inside his mouth, that could only be described as his raison d'etre. The spaghetti, which is infiltrating Edward's body at an astonishing rate, left a delectable tingle in his mouth. However, it couldn't last forever. For he had but one serving in his bowl and no more. This was the last of the spaghetti in the house, so he better savor the last few scoops, which were now barely enough to cover the bottom of the large bowl. Edward now stopped. He rethought his game plan. He needed to make this night count. He shut his eyes and tried something spontaneous. He let the fork splash against the floor and began to ravish the noodles with his open palm, feeling their lubricated meat sauce running between his fingers, gasping the clump and feeling the moisture drip down his wrists. A shiver overtook him and his heartbeat was racing. His temperature rose, and before he had realized what had overtaken him, there he was, laying on his bed straddling the bowl of spaghetti, with lustful intentions in his eyes. The juicy pasta was strung along his hands and lead towards his trousers. He ran his now bare shaft along the inside of the bowl, along the saucy interior and finally into the mound of pasta he had gathered. Its warm embrace tightly gripped along the tip. Ed was really getting into it. He mounted the bowl and begun to plunge forth. A few rounds had passed. By then he had already spread his secret sauce amongst the Italian dish. He was done for now. But none could have guessed what would happen next. Hours went by and Edward felt as though something was missing. His stomach was filled but his heart was aching for more. No other food could please him in such a way that spaghetti could. Desolate he pondered. With his hand upon his heart and a single strand of spaghetti strung from his mouth, he struck an idea. A brilliant idea. He sprung from one side of the bed to the other, grabbed the hidden latch beneath his bed and the mattress folded inward toward his hidden lair. He crawled within the hole and lowered himself down the ladder. He kept the noodle safely tucked in his shirt pocket, right beside his heart. Hours later, deep within the depths of his lair, Professor Edward was ever enclosing his goal. Soon enough, he would obtain all the delicious spaghetti he could ever want. He slipped the noodle onto a glass slide and placed it into the large machine before him. He adjusted the translucent chamber where the spaghetti would emerge from, cranked the handle and clenched the clutch with one hand. With the other he held the source of energy from the power outlet and plugged it into the non-corrosive amalgamation socket. Thrust it forward and killed the asynchronous neon anti-electromagnetic transmitter. The machine began to rumble violently. Surges of electricity ran rampant throughout the machine. The psi-emulsification bay was emitting a bright glow. It was a blinding light. Edward fell to the floor, just in time for a tremendous bang.
Thunk.
This caused Eddie to drop to his knees yet again and cover his head. He stayed like that for a few moments, then opened his eyes. It's dark, he thought as he tried his best to get a grip on anything around him. He could feel. He gripped the crank and pulled himself up. He could see a faint red light veiled by a thick cloud of smoke. The smoke clung to his face, as he whipped his wrist across his brow. This wasn't smoke, he thought, it's steam. He pulled himself up into a standing position and leaned forward. To his delight, the overwhelming smell of spaghetti filled his lungs. Frantically he reached his hand into the chamber and slid his hand into the giant mound of steaming hot pasta. Slid his fingers across the noodles. He had done it, he thought. He had created a plethora of pasta from just one noodle. By God, Eddie exclaimed, as he slipped his fingers in between the moist noodles, interlacing them like a lover would with the fingers of their sweetheart. Eddie started to drift off into his fantasies when suddenly, he could feel the noodles lace their way around his fingers, like a hand. They tightened their grip and pulled on his palm. Edward took a step back and pulled to reveal a spaghetti arm attached to the spaghetti hand. Then another emerged from the chamber and grasped at the edge. What could this be? Thought Eddie as he continued to pull the rubbery limb from the machine. He saw a bulbous mound of noodle emerge from the sea of spaghetti and meat sauce. He took a closer look, because it was still too dark to make out definite features. The mound bent back to reveal a perfect mirror image of Edward's face, glimmering red in dimly lit light. A large figure stepped out of the chamber and stepped towards Edward. He knew exactly what to do. He leaned forward and placed his lips gently on its smooth noodle lips. He reached his tongue out and begun wrestling with the spaghetti monster's tonsilles. But it wasn't a monster, he couldn't refer to it as that, he considered it a work of great beauty. What can I even call you? Eddie exclaimed as he snapped back to reality and questioned the situation he was in. What on earth are you? He said bashfully toward the creature he couldn't bring himself to call a monster.
You can call me Spagheti.
As it leaned forward and placed its arms gracefully on Eddie's shoulders. And
My body is spaghetti,
said Spagheti sensually. They both extend their arms toward one another and Eddie fell backwards into his workbench. Spagheti pressed his body against Eddie, whose shirt was now covered in sauce. Eddie grasped the side of its hips and begun working his way up toward its back. It mounted Eddie and kissed his ear, tugged down his trousers and rubbed up against him. Edward could feel his noodle grinding up on Spagheti's noodle. Simultaneously they stiffened. He slid his noodle lips toward his ear and whispered. Stick it in. The transhuman used his noodle hands to open the tip of his mighty noodle and leave it bare for Eddie to enter. Edward geared his shaft toward the opening and lunged his hips forward. He could feel the texture of the wet noodle and the moisture that gushed forth. Spagheti ran his arms up Eddie's shirt and Eddie clenched onto its muscular noodle back. Little trickles of meat fell forth from Spagheti's mouth as he redirected it towards his counterparts. Eddie couldn't hold on much longer. Under his breath he let out a moan and Spagheti could have bet he heard him say stop. But clearly his body was asking for more. Spagheti raised its legs on top of Eddie and begun gyrating its hips. Eddie couldn't hold on any longer, he came within Spagheti's giant noodle, and gasped for air. Edward exclaimed. As his body went stiff and he came again. Edward pulled out and climbed from beneath Spagheti. He was fully satisfied and he'd gotten tired from all this action. He yawned and made his way to bed. Today was a great day, he thought to himself. When suddenly a shadow followed him up the ladder and behind his bed, which Edward had just gotten himself tucked into. He heard a voice from behind him.
It isn't ogre until Spagheti says it's ogre.
Edward could feel arms reaching around his bare body, this time much larger than before. He struggled to get away. But the giant spaghetti ogre was too powerful for him. He felt a very large noodle rise behind him and stroke his ass. Before he knew it, he was being deeply penetrated by the strange new Spagheti's giant rubbery cock. He could feel his entire body becoming warped by the soggy noodles. Before Edward could let out a moan, his mouth was being ravaged by the creature's very long appendages. He could feel the meatballs resting on his chin. Edward was fully sealed within the body of Spagheti, whom was pumping Eddie's blood with spaghetti. Poor Edward had no air to consume. He wasn't going to last much longer. With the last few jerks of his body, Edward fell to the ground. In a daze, Edward turned on his light. There was no spaghetti monster to be seen. Maybe it was all a dream, Eddie muttered to himself as he got back into bed. Maybe. He couldn't help but taste something sweet in his mouth for a few days after.